The morning I realized my neighbors believed my land belonged to them was the morning I nearly spit hot coffee all over my porch. I'm not exaggerating either. One second I was standing there enjoying a quiet Saturday sunrise, looking across the same pasture I'd looked at for most of my life, and the next I was staring at what looked like the staging area for a commercial construction project. There were stacks of concrete blocks, bundles of steel rods, giant rolls of pipe, portable barriers, orange safety fencing, and enough material to build a small town. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I was looking at the wrong property. I actually rubbed my eyes like some old man in a cartoon. Then I noticed a laminated sign attached to a wooden stake. Temporary construction storage area. Authorized personnel only. That's when my confusion turned into something else entirely. See, this wasn't abandoned land. It wasn't county property. It wasn't part of the subdivision next door. It belonged to me. Every inch of it. My name was on the deed. My grandfather's name had been on the deed before mine. His father worked this ground before paved roads ever reached this side of the county. Meanwhile, the subdivision sitting next to my pasture had only existed for about 8 years. Nice houses, expensive landscaping, fancy entrance sign, homeowners association with more opinions than common sense. Most of the folks living there were decent enough, but the board running that HOA had a reputation. They acted like every piece of land they could see from their golf carts somehow fell under their authority. Apparently now that included mine. I climbed into my truck and drove down to the edge of the property where the materials had been dumped. Tire tracks cut deep across the grass. Several survey markers had been pushed over. Someone had clearly spent hours moving equipment onto my land, and nobody had bothered to ask permission. That part got under my skin more than anything. It wasn't just the trespassing. It was the assumption, the confidence, the belief that they could simply take what they needed and deal with the owner later. The sign listed a project contact number, so I pulled out my phone and called. A man answered on the third ring. His name was Trevor Maddox. He introduced himself as the construction coordinator for the new Lakeside Commons Clubhouse project. I explained who I was and asked why his company had dumped construction supplies on private property. There was a pause. Then he gave a little chuckle that instantly raised my blood pressure. "Oh, that land belongs to you?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "That's usually how ownership works." Another chuckle. "Well, we just needed a temporary staging area for a few weeks. It's not a big deal." Not a big deal. Funny how people always say that when they're talking about somebody else's property. I told him he had no permission to use my land and needed to remove everything immediately. His tone changed slightly. Not apologetic, just annoyed. "Look, we're in the middle of a major project. Moving all that material right now would create delays and cost a fortune. It's temporary. Nobody's getting hurt." I remember looking out across those piles of material while he spoke and thinking about my grandfather. He used to tell me that the fastest way to lose your rights was to stop defending them. Let one person cross a fence line today, and tomorrow they'll swear it was always theirs. I could almost hear his voice standing there in the pasture. Trevor kept talking. "Just give us a couple weeks, and we'll clear everything out." Then he made the mistake that changed everything. He laughed again and said, "Relax, man. Relax. That's what did it. Not the trespassing. Not the arrogance. Not even the damage to the property. It was that one word. Relax." As if I was overreacting. As if I should be grateful they picked my pasture instead of somebody else's. I ended the call without another word. Then I stood there for a long minute staring at their supplies while a plan slowly started forming in my head. Now, before anybody starts thinking I lost my temper and did something stupid, let me be clear. I didn't damage a single piece of their property. I didn't steal anything. I didn't threaten anybody. What I did was something far more effective. That afternoon, I drove into town and stopped at Miller's Auto Repair, where my friend Wade worked. Wade was the kind of guy who could move a bulldozer through a keyhole if you gave him enough time. After I told him what happened, he nearly fell off a stool laughing. "You're kidding," he said. "They actually dumped all that stuff on your land. Every last pallet." He grinned. "And you're thinking what I think you're thinking?" I smiled back. "Depends what you're thinking." Wade laughed even harder. "Well, whatever it is, I'm in." A few hours later, I stopped by another friend's place. His name was Roy Jenkins, retired truck driver, lifelong troublemaker, and one of the most creative people I've ever met when it came to solving problems. After hearing the story, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You know what's funny about temporary storage?" "What's that?" I asked. He grinned. "Sometimes temporary things become permanent. The three of us sat there until sunset, drinking coffee and discussing possibilities. By the time darkness settled across the county, we had a plan. A ridiculous plan. A completely legal plan. And if it worked, Trevor Maddox was going to have the worst Monday morning of his professional career. By 10 that night, the pasture was completely dark except for the glow of a half moon hanging over the tree line. And honestly, if someone had driven past, they probably would have thought we were filming a low-budget heist movie. Wade showed up first with access to a forklift he'd borrowed from a quarry owner who happened to owe him a favor. And Roy rolled in behind him with an old flatbed truck that sounded like it had survived 3 wars and at least 2 bad marriages. The funny thing was none of us were angry anymore. Earlier that day, I had been furious. By nightfall, I was mostly amused. The more I thought about Trevor telling me to relax, the funnier it became. So I relaxed. I relaxed so much that I decided to reorganize the construction company's entire storage operation. We started with the concrete blocks. Wade slid the forklift under the pallets and moved them one by one nearly 200 yards deeper into my property. Then came the steel bundles. Then the pipe. Then the fencing. Then every other piece of material they had left sitting on my land. We worked slowly and carefully because damaging anything would ruin the whole point. Every item remained exactly where it belonged, just not where they expected it to be. Around midnight, Roy climbed off the truck, wiped sweat from his forehead, and looked around at the growing pile. "You know," he said, "if we're doing this, we should do it right." I knew exactly what he meant. Earlier that afternoon, we'd gathered materials from around the farm. Old rolls of rusted barbed wire that had been sitting behind a shed for years. Tractor tires too worn out to use anymore. Fence posts. Scrap lumber. Nothing fancy. Nothing illegal. Just enough to make a statement. So while Wade continued moving pallets, Roy and I started building. We laid out a giant rectangle around the materials. Then we drove posts into the ground. We strung barbed wire. We stacked tires into rough barricades. We created something that looked halfway between a livestock enclosure and a prison yard. The entire time we couldn't stop laughing. At one point, Roy stepped back and said, "You realize this is either the dumbest idea we've ever had or the greatest." "Probably both," I told him. Around 3 in the morning, I brought out the final piece. A large sheet of plywood I'd picked up earlier that day. I'd already painted it bright white. Then I grabbed a can of red spray paint and carefully wrote a message across the center in giant letters. "Storage yard. Courtesy of your own trespassing." Wade nearly dropped the paint can laughing when he saw it. By sunrise, the transformation was complete. What had started as an unauthorized construction storage area now looked like the world's most embarrassing junkyard exhibit. The materials sat untouched in the middle. The fencing surrounded them. The tires formed ugly barricades. The sign stood proudly in the center like a monument to bad decisions. We packed up our equipment and headed back toward the house just as the first sunlight crept across the pasture. I slept for maybe 2 hours before the show started. The first horn blast woke me up. Then another. Then another. I stepped onto my porch carrying a fresh cup of coffee and immediately saw 3 pickup trucks parked near the property line. Construction workers stood around pointing toward the pasture. A supervisor was pacing in circles. Another guy was waving his arms like he was directing air traffic. Even from a distance, I could hear shouting. It was beautiful. I sat down in a rocking chair and watched. More trucks arrived. More workers gathered. Eventually, somebody spotted me on the porch. A few minutes later, a convoy of very unhappy people started marching toward my driveway. Leading the group was Trevor Maddox. He looked considerably less confident than he had the day before. "What the hell is this?" he demanded before he even reached the porch. I took a sip of coffee. "Morning, Trevor." "Don't morning Trevor me. What did you do?" "I organized your materials." "You moved them." "Still on my property." "You fenced them in." "Also on my property." His face turned bright red. Behind him, the supervisors looked equally miserable. One of them pointed toward the pasture. "We need access to those materials immediately." I nodded. "I imagine you do." Trevor took a deep breath. "Listen, we're trying to build a community clubhouse. You're delaying an entire project." "Actually," I said, "you delayed your own project when you dumped thousands of dollars worth of supplies on land you don't own." Nobody had a response to that. They just stared at me. Finally, Trevor said, "Fine. What do you want?" There it was. The question he should have asked before entering my property in the first place. I stood up, walked inside, and returned carrying a county survey map. Then I walked down to the edge of the driveway and pointed toward the survey markers visible across the pasture. "You see those?" I asked. "Every one of those markers confirms the same thing. That land belongs to me, which means every item sitting out there was placed there without permission." Trevor crossed his arms. "We're willing to compensate you. Now you are. Let's be reasonable." I laughed. "Reasonable? Yesterday you told me to relax." For the first time, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. A few workers exchanged awkward glances. One of them actually smiled before quickly looking away. Trevor noticed and shot him a glare. Then he turned back toward me. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish here?" That question deserved an honest answer. "I'm teaching you something." "Teaching me what?" "That private property isn't a suggestion." Silence. Long silence. The kind that makes people shift their weight and stare at the ground. Finally, Trevor muttered something under his breath and walked away. The supervisors followed. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Around noon, I got a call from an attorney representing the HOA. The lawyer sounded much smoother than Trevor. More professional. Less emotional. He asked if we could discuss a practical solution. I told him I'd be happy to discuss practical solutions after someone explained why my property had been occupied without consent. He danced around the question. I pushed harder. Eventually, he admitted that project planners assumed the pasture belonged to the HOA's undeveloped expansion area. Assumed. There was that word again. Another way of saying nobody bothered checking. The lawyer proposed a payment for temporary use. I declined. He proposed a rental agreement. I declined that too. Then he asked a question that caught me by surprise. "What do you actually want?" I looked out the window toward the pasture. An apology would be a nice start. He didn't say anything for several seconds. Then he quietly admitted nobody on the board wanted to apologize because they were afraid it would look like an admission of liability. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about construction anymore. This was about pride. The HOA board had spent years throwing its weight around, sending warning letters, threatening fines, telling people what color they could paint their front doors. Now they'd finally run into someone they couldn't intimidate. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation became local entertainment. Every morning, workers showed up hoping the problem had somehow solved itself overnight. Every morning, the fenced storage yard was still there. Folks started slowing down on the county road just to look at it. People took photos. Somebody posted pictures online. Then the jokes started spreading. My personal favorite was when someone nicknamed it Fort HOA. Even the sheriff found it amusing. I'd called him the morning after we moved everything and explained the situation before rumors started flying. After reviewing the survey records, he simply shrugged and said, "As long as nobody damages anything, sounds like a civil matter to me." That was exactly what I expected. Weeks passed. The clubhouse construction slowed to a crawl. Contractors started missing deadlines. Additional crews had to be rescheduled. Equipment sat idle. Rumors began circulating that replacement materials would cost a fortune because certain specialty components had long lead times. Every delay created another delay. Every delay created another expense. And every expense traced back to one decision made by people who thought asking permission was optional. Then one afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after everything started, I received another voicemail from Trevor. Only this time there was no arrogance left. No confidence. No attitude. Just exhaustion. He sounded like a man carrying the weight of a disaster he couldn't fix. "Look," he said, "we should have handled this differently. We all know that. Can we please figure something out?" I listened to the message twice while standing on my porch looking across the pasture toward the fenced enclosure sitting in the distance. For the first time since this whole mess began, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The strange thing about winning a fight is that sometimes the victory arrives long before the other side realizes they've already lost. Standing on my porch that afternoon, listening to Trevor's voicemail for the second time, I finally understood that this was one of those moments. 3 weeks earlier, he'd laughed at me. 3 weeks earlier, he'd treated my property rights like an inconvenience standing in the way of his construction schedule. Now the confidence was gone. The swagger was gone. All that remained was a tired man trying to stop a problem that had grown far bigger than he ever expected. For a few minutes, I genuinely considered calling him back. Not because I felt pressured, but because my grandfather always believed a person should know when enough was enough. He used to say that revenge without a lesson was just anger wearing a different hat. The lesson had already been delivered. The entire county knew what happened. The HOA board knew what happened. The contractors knew what happened. Most importantly, the people who made the decision knew what happened. Then something unexpected occurred. A member of the HOA board showed up at my property. Not Trevor, not a lawyer, an actual board member named Sandra Whitaker. I'd seen her before at county meetings. She stepped out of her SUV, walked up my driveway, and to her credit, she didn't start with excuses. She didn't start with legal language either. She simply said, "We messed up." Honestly, hearing those 3 words caught me off guard more than anything else in the entire story. She admitted nobody should have authorized the storage site without confirming ownership. She admitted the board assumed the pasture belonged to land they planned to acquire someday. She admitted arrogance had played a role. Most importantly, she apologized without adding conditions or qualifications. No, if anyone was offended. No miscommunication occurred. Just a straightforward apology. We stood there talking for nearly an hour. For the first time, I felt like I was speaking with an actual human being instead of a corporate memo wearing a polo shirt. Before leaving, Sandra asked if there was any path forward. I told her there was. First, the board would need to publicly acknowledge the mistake. Second, they would need to cover every cost associated with restoring the damaged pasture, including the survey markers and rutted ground. Third, they would need to remove the materials themselves under supervision and stay off the property afterward. A week later they agreed. Every condition. No arguments. No negotiations. No threats. Just signatures. Watching them remove those supplies was almost anticlimactic. The same trucks that had delivered everything returned to haul it away. The same workers who had unloaded it now loaded it back up. Nobody shouted. Nobody argued. Nobody laughed. It felt less like a construction project and more like a public apology unfolding in slow motion. Trevor was there too. He looked 10 years older than he had a month earlier. At one point, he walked over while I was standing near the fence. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then he nodded toward the emptying enclosure and said, "You really made your point." I nodded back. "You really gave me the opportunity." To his credit, he actually laughed. Not the smug laugh from our first phone call. A real laugh. The kind people make when they've finally accepted reality. Then he shook my hand and walked away. That was the last serious conversation we ever had. The clubhouse eventually got built. The HOA survived. Life moved on. But the story didn't disappear. Around town, people still bring it up from time to time. Usually at the diner or the feed store. Someone will mention the subdivision, and somebody else will grin and say, "Remember Ford HOA?" Then everyone laughs. The funniest part is what happened afterward. The HOA became dramatically more careful about property boundaries. Surveyors got involved before every expansion project. Permission forms appeared for everything. Suddenly, the organization that once assumed ownership of anything nearby became obsessed with documentation. Amazing what a little embarrassment can accomplish. As for me, I kept a small section of that enclosure standing for years. Not the whole thing, just enough. A few fence posts. One old tractor tire. The weathered plywood sign. Rain faded the paint. Sun cracked the wood. Time slowly wore it down. But every time I drove past it, I remembered something important. Property isn't just dirt. It isn't acreage. It isn't lines on a map. Sometimes it's memory. Sometimes it's family. Sometimes it's the last connection to people who spent their lives building something they hoped would outlive them. That's why I fought so hard over what some people called a temporary inconvenience. Because temporary disrespect has a habit of becoming permanent if nobody pushes back. Eventually, I removed the remaining fence and cleaned up the area completely. Today, you'd never know the whole thing happened. The pasture looks exactly the way it did before. Quiet, open, peaceful. But every now and then, when I'm sitting on that same porch with a cup of coffee watching the sunrise, I think about how close I came to simply letting it go. I think about how easy it would have been to accept the excuse, wait a few weeks, and hope everything worked itself out. Maybe that would have been easier. Maybe it would have caused less drama. Then again, maybe it would have taught the wrong lesson. And that's where I'd like to hear from you. If you walked outside tomorrow morning and discovered a company, an HOA, or even a neighbor had decided your property was theirs to use without permission, what would you have done? Would you have accepted the apology and waited patiently, or would you have found a way to make sure they never forgot whose land they were standing on? Let me know down in the comments because honestly, even after all these years, people still argue about whether I was defending my rights or just giving trespassers a taste of their own medicine.